In 1972, Deep Purple recorded the most famous guitar riff in rock history. You know it. Everyone knows it. That opening to Smoke on the Water became so iconic that guitar store employees literally banned customers from playing it because they heard it dozens of times every single day. The song came from their album Machine Head, which sold over 7 million copies and cemented Deep Purple as one of the biggest rock bands on the planet. By 1976, just 4 years after that triumph, the band had completely fallen apart. The guitarist and the lead singer weren't speaking to each other. The original lineup had disbanded, and the man who wrote that legendary riff, Ritchie Blackmore, would eventually leave the band not once, not twice, but 3 separate times over the next 30 years. What makes Deep Purple's story so fascinating is this. They weren't destroyed by drugs or money problems or record label interference. They were destroyed by something far more common and far more devastating in the music industry. Ego. Pure, unfiltered ego from some of the most talented musicians in rock history who simply could not stand to share a stage with each other. This is the story of how 100 million album sales, countless sold-out arenas, and a place in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame wasn't enough to keep 5 brilliant musicians from tearing each other apart. If you're into classic rock documentaries, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. We've got more stories about the bands that shaped rock history coming your way. Deep Purple formed in Hartford, England in 1968, and right from the start, they were different from other rock bands of that era. While most groups were built around a charismatic frontman, Deep Purple was built around virtuoso musicianship. These weren't just guys who could play their instruments. These were classically trained musicians who wanted to push rock music into entirely new territory. The original lineup included Ritchie Blackmore on guitar, Jon Lord on keyboards, Ian Paice on drums, Nick Simper on bass, and Rod Evans on vocals. But it was the 1969 lineup change that would create what fans still call the definitive Deep Purple sound. Rod Evans and Nick Simper were replaced by Ian Gillan on vocals and Roger Glover on bass. This became known as the Mark II lineup, and this was the version of Deep Purple that would change rock music forever. What made this lineup special was the chemistry between Ritchie Blackmore's guitar and Jon Lord's keyboard. Most rock bands at the time treated keyboards as background decoration, something to fill out the sound behind the guitars. Deep Purple made the keyboard a lead instrument. Jon Lord's Hammond organ didn't just support the songs. It battled with Blackmore's guitar for dominance, creating this incredible tension and energy that became their signature sound. Their 1970 album, Deep Purple in Rock, hit number 4 on the UK charts and announced to the world that this band was something special. Songs like Child in Time showcased Ian Gillan's incredible vocal range, with his ability to scream and wail in ways that would influence an entire generation of rock and metal singers. Ritchie Blackmore's guitar solos were complex, fast, and absolutely ferocious. Together, they created a sound that was heavier than Led Zeppelin, more technical than Black Sabbath, and more aggressive than anything else on the radio. By 1971, Deep Purple had become one of the most popular rock bands in the world. They were selling out arenas across Europe and America. Their album Fireball went to number 1 in the UK. They had achieved everything a rock band could hope for, but the cracks were already starting to show, and they centered around one man who would come to define both the band's greatest triumphs and their most bitter failures: Ritchie Blackmore. If you're enjoying this deep dive into Deep Purple's history, hit that like button and subscribe. We're just getting started with this story. Chapter 2. Machine Head and the Smoke on the Water legend. December 1971. Deep Purple traveled to Montreux, Switzerland to record what would become their most famous album. They had booked the Montreux Casino to use as a recording studio, and they planned to capture the raw, live energy that made their concerts so powerful. They arrived in town on December 4th, ready to start work the next day. That night, they decided to go watch a concert at the casino. Frank Zappa and the Mothers of Invention were performing. Deep Purple sat in the audience, relaxing before their recording session began. Then, during Zappa's performance, someone in the crowd fired a flare gun into the ceiling. The ceiling caught fire instantly. Within minutes, the entire Montreux Casino was engulfed in flames. Deep Purple evacuated along with everyone else and stood outside watching the casino burn. They watched the smoke rise off the water of Lake Geneva, the flames reflecting on the lake's surface in the December darkness. And in that moment, Ritchie Blackmore and bassist Roger Glover looked at each other and realized they had just witnessed something that needed to become a song. But they had a problem. The casino where they were supposed to record had just burned to the ground. Their equipment was safe in storage, but they had no studio. They scrambled to find alternatives and eventually ended up recording in the Grand Hotel in Montreux, rolling their equipment down the hotel hallways and setting up in whatever empty conference rooms and hallways they could find. Hotel guests complained about the noise. The band worked anyway, driven by a creative energy that wouldn't be stopped. The result was Machine Head, released in March 1972. The album opened with Highway Star, a song Blackmore wrote in the back of a tour bus, featuring one of the fastest and most technically demanding guitar solos in rock history. It included Lazy, a blues rock masterpiece with a keyboard solo that showed exactly why Jon Lord was considered one of the greatest rock organists ever. And of course, it had Smoke on the Water, the song about watching the Montreux casino burn. Machine Head went to #1 in 6 different countries. It sold 7 million copies worldwide. Smoke on the Water became such a massive hit that it essentially took on a life of its own, separate from the band. That opening riff, the one that goes dun 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 da dun, became the first thing every teenage guitarist learned to play. It's been called the most recognizable guitar riff in rock history, more famous than Satisfaction by the Rolling Stones, more famous than Whole Lotta Love by Led Zeppelin. Deep Purple had reached the absolute peak of rock stardom. They were touring the world to sold-out crowds. They were making enormous amounts of money. Critics praised them as one of the most innovative and talented rock bands of the decade. Everything they had worked for had come true. But here's where the ego wars really began, and they began with the man who wrote that legendary riff. Ritchie Blackmore was, by all accounts, a musical genius. His technical skill on guitar was extraordinary. His solos were complex, blazingly fast, and incredibly creative. He could play classical music, blues, hard rock, and everything in between. Other guitarists studied his playing the way classical musicians study Mozart. He knew he was brilliant, and he expected everyone around him to acknowledge that brilliance. The problem was that Deep Purple had 2 other brilliant musicians who weren't interested in being Ritchie Blackmore's backing band. Ian Gillan, the vocalist, had one of the most powerful and distinctive voices in rock music. Jon Lord's keyboard work was revolutionary. These men didn't see themselves as sidemen. To Blackmore's vision, they saw themselves as equal partners in creating the Deep Purple sound. This created a fundamental tension that ran through everything the band did. Blackmore wanted to push the music in a harder, more guitar-driven direction. Gillan wanted more bluesy, soulful material that showcased his vocal abilities. Lord wanted to incorporate more classical influences and complex arrangements. All 3 of them were right. All 3 of them were talented enough to lead a band. But a band can't have 3 leaders pulling in 3 different directions. The conflicts started small. Disagreements about which songs to put on albums, arguments about stage positioning during concerts, debates about how long guitar solos should be versus keyboard solos versus vocal showcases. But these small conflicts revealed a deeper problem. None of these men were willing to compromise their artistic vision, and none of them were willing to let anyone else have creative control. Ritchie. Blackmore, in particular, became known for his difficult personality. He would stop playing in the middle of concerts if he felt the sound wasn't perfect. He would walk out of recording sessions if things weren't going his way. He demanded that his guitar be louder in the mix than everyone else's instruments. Other band members started describing him as impossible to work with, a perfectionist whose perfectionism made collaboration nearly impossible. Ian Gillan wasn't much easier. He had his own ideas about what Deep Purple should sound like, and he wasn't afraid to fight for those ideas. The man had walked away from an offer to sing for Black Sabbath because he wanted to stay with Deep Purple and have creative control over his own music. He wasn't about to let a guitarist, no matter how talented, tell him what to sing or how to sing it. By 1973, the tension had become so bad that band members weren't even speaking to each other except when absolutely necessary. They would show up for concerts, play their sets, and leave without any social interaction. Recording sessions became battles, with each musician trying to dominate the final product. The music was still incredible because these were world-class talents, but the process of creating that music had become toxic. The album Who Do We Think We Are, released in January 1973, captured this tension perfectly. You can hear it in the music. The songs are technically brilliant but feel fragmented, like 5 different musicians playing 5 different songs at the same time, and just happening to stay in the same key. Critics noticed, fans noticed, and most importantly, the band members themselves knew that something fundamental had broken. June 1973, Deep Purple announced that Ian Gillan and Roger Glover were leaving the band. The official statement said it was an amicable departure, that everyone remained friends, that this was just a natural evolution. Nobody believed it. Everyone in the music industry knew what had really happened. Ritchie Blackmore and Ian Gillan had reached a point where they could no longer work together, and one of them had to go. Blackmore stayed, Gillan left, and with him went bassist Roger Glover, who had been Gillan's primary ally in the creative battles against Blackmore's dominance. Deep Purple replaced them with David Coverdale on vocals and Glenn Hughes on bass, creating what became known as the Mark III lineup. This version of the band had a funkier, more soulful sound that showcased David Coverdale's bluesy voice. They released 2 albums with this lineup, Burn and Stormbringer, both of which sold well and received positive reviews. But the fundamental problems hadn't been solved. They had just been temporarily paused. Ritchie Blackmore still wanted complete creative control. The other band members still weren't willing to give it to him. The Ego Wars had just found new participants. By 1975, Blackmore had decided he was done trying to make Deep Purple work. He quit the band he had co-founded and formed his own group, Rainbow, where he could have the absolute control he had always wanted. Deep Purple replaced him with Tommy Bolin, a talented guitarist from the United States, but the magic was gone. The chemistry that had made Deep Purple special had been built on the tension between Blackmore's guitar and Lord's keyboard, Blackmore's perfectionism and Gillan's powerful vocals. Without those elements, Deep Purple was just another rock band. They released 1 album with Tommy Bolin, Come Taste the Band, in 1975. It was a commercial disappointment. More importantly, it felt like a Deep Purple album in name only. The sound that had defined them, that combination of classical influences and hard rock aggression and virtuoso musicianship, had disappeared. What remained was technically competent but emotionally hollow. In July 1976, Deep Purple officially disbanded. They had lasted 8 years from their first album to their final concert. They had sold over 70 million albums worldwide. They had influenced countless other bands and helped create the sound of heavy metal. And they had destroyed themselves through ego wars and power struggles that made it impossible for 5 brilliant musicians to stay in the same room. The breakup should have been the end of the story, but Deep Purple's story was far from over. The revolving door was just beginning, and the ego wars would continue for decades. 1984. 8 years after the breakup, the classic Mark II lineup of Deep Purple reunited. Ritchie Blackmore, Ian Gillan, John Lord, Ian Pace, and Roger Glover all agreed to put their differences aside and make music together again. They released Perfect Strangers, an album that proved they still had the magic that made them special in the first place. The album went platinum in multiple countries. The tour sold out arenas worldwide. Fans were ecstatic to have the original lineup back, but the underlying problems hadn't changed. Ritchie Blackmore was still Ritchie Blackmore, demanding perfection and control. Ian Gillan was still Ian Gillan, unwilling to compromise his artistic vision. The same conflicts that had torn them apart in the 1970s resurfaced almost immediately. They managed to stay together for 9 years this time, releasing several successful albums, but the tensions were always there, simmering beneath the surface. In 1993, Ian Gillan left the band again. Deep Purple replaced him with Joe Lynn Turner, who had previously sung for Ritchie Blackmore's band Rainbow. But by 1993, even Blackmore had apparently had enough. In November of that year, during a tour of Japan, Blackmore played his final concert with Deep Purple and walked away from the band for the 3rd and final time. The reason? The same reason as always. Creative. Differences. Power struggles. Ego. Blackmore wanted the band to go in a more medieval, neoclassical direction. The other members wanted to stay true to the hard rock sound that had made them famous. Neither side was willing to budge, so Blackmore left and formed his own band. Blackmore's Night, playing Renaissance and folk-inspired music. Deep Purple continued without him, bringing in guitarist Steve Morse to replace Blackmore. This version of Deep Purple, without their original guitar genius, has now lasted longer than any other lineup in the band's history. They've released multiple albums, toured extensively, and maintained a loyal fan base. In 2016, they were finally inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, an honor that had been delayed for years despite their obvious qualifications. But here's the thing that really captures the essence of Deep Purple's story. At the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction ceremony, Ritchie Blackmore refused to attend. He didn't show, up to accept one of the highest honors in rock music. When asked about it later, he said he had no interest in nostalgia and had moved beyond his Deep Purple years. Meanwhile, Ian Gillan gave a speech praising the band's legacy and acknowledging the conflicts that had defined their career. Even at their moment of greatest recognition, when they were being honored for their contributions to rock music, the ego wars continued. Blackmore and Gillan couldn't even be in the same room for one evening to accept an award. Today, Deep Purple continues to tour with Steve Morse on guitar, Don Airey on keyboards, Ian Gillan on vocals, Roger Glover on bass, and Ian Pace on drums. Ian Paice is the only member who has been with the band through every single lineup change, the one constant presence through 40 years of revolving door musicians and ego battles. He's seen it all, outlasted everyone, and somehow maintained his sanity through the chaos. The band released their latest album, Whoosh, in 2020, and it debuted at #1 in several European countries. They proved that even without Ritchie Blackmore, even after decades of conflicts and lineup changes, they can still make music that resonates with fans. The Deep Purple sound, that combination of hard rock aggression and classical influences and virtuoso musicianship, remains intact even as the musicians who created it have come and gone. The question that haunts Deep Purple's legacy is this: what could they have been if they had stayed together? If Ritchie Blackmore, Ian Gillan, and Jon Lord had found a way to work together through their differences instead of letting ego destroy their partnership, how much more music could they have created? How many more legendary albums? How many more iconic songs beyond Smoke on the Water and Highway Star? They sold over 100 million albums across all their various lineups. They influenced an entire generation of metal bands, from Metallica to Iron Maiden to Judas Priest. They pioneered the use of keyboards in hard rock music. They proved that rock music could be both technically sophisticated and commercially successful. Their place in rock history is secure, but they could have been so much more. They had the talent, the chemistry, and the opportunity to become the biggest rock band of the 1970s. Instead, they became a cautionary tale about what happens when brilliant artists can't put their egos aside for the greater good of the music. The tragedy of Deep Purple isn't that they failed. They didn't fail. They succeeded beyond what most bands could ever dream of achieving. The tragedy is that they succeeded despite themselves, despite the conflicts and power struggles that should have destroyed them long before they made their mark on music history. And the even greater tragedy is that we'll never know what masterpieces they could have created if they had managed to stay together. Ritchie Blackmore once said in an interview that he had no regrets about leaving Deep Purple, that he did what he needed to do for his own artistic vision. Ian Gillan has said similar things, that the conflicts were inevitable given the personalities involved, and that he's proud of what they accomplished despite the difficulties. Both men are probably right, but that doesn't make the story any less sad. In the end, Deep Purple gave us some of the most iconic rock music ever recorded. They gave us Smoke on the Water, a riff that will outlive all of us. They gave us Child in Time and Highway Star, and dozens of other songs that defined an era. They gave us proof that rock music could be intelligent, technical, and complex while still being powerful and exciting. But they also gave us a reminder that talent alone isn't enough, that success isn't enough, that even 100 million album sales and worldwide fame can't overcome the fundamental human problem of ego. Some of the most talented musicians who ever lived couldn't figure out how to share a stage without destroying each other. And because of that, we lost out on decades of music that should have been made. Deep Purple's story isn't just about a band that broke up and got back together and broke up again. It's about what happens when artistic vision conflicts with collaborative necessity, when individual brilliance overwhelms collective achievement, when ego becomes more important than the music itself. It's a story that's been repeated countless times in rock history, from the Beatles to the Eagles to Guns N' Roses. But somehow, Deep Purple's version feels particularly tragic because the talent was so obvious, the potential was so enormous, and the waste was so complete. If you want to hear more stories about the bands that shaped rock history, make sure you're subscribed to this channel and hit that notification bell. We've got more documentaries coming that explore the triumphs and tragedies of the music that defined generations. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into Deep Purple's complicated legacy, leave a comment below about which band we should cover next. Thanks for watching.